From Eyewitness News, Connecticut's most watched local political program, this is Face the State.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Dennis House. The first primaries are over in South Carolina and Nevada, where the candidates are now spending big bucks. The Connecticut primary is still 10 weeks away. So what kind of economic impact will there be for us? With us today is David Cadden. He's a management professor emeritus at Quinnipiac University, and Dan Papermaster, an attorney with vast political experience, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Gentlemen, first of all, thank you for being with us here today. And David, I'll begin with you. What is the economic impact, let's say, to New Hampshire?
New Hampshire is a little tighter in terms of releasing information, but a study done by the state 20 years ago indicated that $150 million was pumped into the state. So one can imagine what they would be today. So some of the numbers are a little off in the sense that the candidates spend money on television stations in adjoining states that broadcast into New Hampshire. So it's probably understated. It's much clearer the economic benefit that you see in Iowa.
Dan, we're dating ourselves here, but I remember interviewing you in New Hampshire in 2004 when Senator Joe Lieberman ran for president there. You were part of the operation there. What kind of things does a campaign spend money on in a state like that?
Well, there are really two parts. The campaign spends a lot of money on field operatives and housing people who are coming in out of the state, acting as surrogates during the course of the campaign, on television, on print materials. But at the same time, the other economic benefit is the thousands of press that follow these campaigns. And so there's really both the dynamic of all these campaigns coming into a state, but also the media following those candidates throughout the state, spending money in restaurants, in bars, and in hotels.
I believe that I interviewed you in the Manchester office with Marshall Lieberman, as I recall. And but there are more than one office, generally speaking. They have offices across the state and full-time staffers?
Absolutely. I mean, New Hampshire's ground zero, along with Iowa, in the beginning of a campaign. And during the Lieberman campaign, we probably had 5 or 6 different field offices throughout the state of New Hampshire, and the same thing is going to be true across the country in various states.
We seem to be kind of left out of this. What will the economic impact of our primary be come April 28th?
I think you see the greatest economic advantage to the first movers in the sense that the earliest primaries are the ones that get the most attention. You have 2,000 reporters in Des Moines during this last Iowa caucuses. So it would depend upon really the positioning of where Connecticut would be and also how many other states would have a primary at the same time.
There are some other primaries on the same day as ours, but it is sort of toward the end of the season. I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions specifically about people, Dan, but you've been through this before. 10 weeks from now, right now we have, there are 8 Democrats, 9 Democrats. How many will there be then?
I would guess that by the time we get to Connecticut, there'll probably be half as many candidates, and obviously it will also depend on whether Michael Bloomberg's strategy continues, whether it works for him by the time we get to Connecticut. They're calling our primary day the Acela primary because it involves a lot of the East Coast states up and down the East Coast along the Acela route. But I would definitely expect some of the candidates are going to just frankly run out of money by the time they get to Connecticut, and so they won't be viable even if they're technically still in the race.
What kind of, the governor has certainly talked about maybe an earlier primary would be good for our state in terms of the economic impact. I know that we had Senator Fasano, Senator Austin on here as well. They say they want to propose something that we would have an earlier primary. What could the economic impact be if, let's say, our primary were, let's say, next week?
I think in that particular case, you would begin to see some economic benefit by having us really moved up so that we're in the top tiers in terms of the sequencing of the primaries and caucuses.
Vice President Joe Biden has stated that he doesn't believe that these 2 earlier states are indicative of America because they are so white, they're not terribly diverse. Looking back on the Lieberman campaign, because Joe Lieberman dropped out after not doing all that well in New Hampshire, do you believe that the whole presidential primary system needs to be revisited?
Well, I think if we've learned anything from this season is that it definitely has to be revisited. The challenges that we had in Iowa, the nature of the demographics in both Iowa and New Hampshire are challenging. I think one thing we have to look at for Connecticut is recognizing that we don't operate in a vacuum. Other states, I'm sure, are going to be looking to change the dates of their primaries as well. And so we should look to strategically place ourselves in the best possible place for Connecticut.
David, I know you want to say, I'll let you.
Yeah, Illinois is trying to position itself to be moved up, perhaps even overtake Iowa and New Hampshire. And there's talk in Pennsylvania to do the same thing.
How does this work? You know, I'm sorry to interrupt, David. You were saying Pennsylvania wants to do the same thing as well.
Yeah.
Because these are big states, and by the time that their primaries roll around, generally there aren't as many candidates. I think that last time we had an April one, it was Mitt Romney was the only one left, I believe, or right?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, there was, in 2012, there was not much left of. But in 2008, when it was a very big primary, Barack Obama came to the Excel Center. Certainly, there was a big impact there because of the advertising rates and things like that. As you look at sort of how these campaigns operate, how do they view Connecticut in terms of, is this a potentially significant primary?
I think it probably falls somewhere in the second tier of primaries. I think the way they look at Connecticut from a pragmatic standpoint is there's a lot of money to be raised in Connecticut, and so they want to come in and try to raise the money here, particularly down in Fairfield County. There's a lot of important folks who've been involved in politics for a long time here, and their support is very valuable. But in terms of number of votes in the Electoral College, we're not that large, and I don't think our demographics really play out in a way that sort of puts us in a strategically valuable pole position.
Dan, you were also the leader of the organization which helped bring the presidential primary to Connecticut back to Hartford back in 1996. What was the economic impact of that?
The economic impact back then was huge. If you look at sort of the math that we used, we raised about $2.5 million to put on the presidential debate, and we think that it pumped about $6 million back into the local economy. You had two presidential candidates coming in with all of their entourages, but at the same time, we had 3,000 members of the media from around the world here in Hartford and Greater Hartford, so the impact was tremendous.
We lost out on getting it for this fall, but what would the impact be in today's dollars, do you think, David?
Well, again, taking a look at Iowa as an example, they found that the January receipts for many restaurants in Des Moines increases by $20,000 for that month during presidential. It looks as though there may be as much as a 40% bump in January in Iowa in retail outlets. Everybody benefits from it. I think Elizabeth Warren spent $1,200 on one Subway order to put together. I mean, everybody can profit. I saw one case where they could charge $1,000 if you wanted to hang a banner off of your building.
The ship for 2020 has obviously sailed, but what advice would you have for lawmakers or business people who want to make Connecticut have a greater voice in the presidential process in 2024? What can we start doing now?
Yeah, let's look for a new date. Let's try to distinguish ourselves at least with a few primaries earlier on in the process, and try to make it a real statement for the country. There's no question it's valuable for the state. There's no question it's a good economic development tool, and so it's definitely something worth reviewing.
Should they try for another debate as well early on?
I think in a vacuum, they should try for another debate. At a certain point, I was actually against this particular venture only because I think the challenges here were that you were going to ultimately negotiate with President Trump, and he's not made a commitment that he will participate in the debates. And so the concern you have there is you spend millions of dollars getting ready for something where a candidate may not show up. So this one's unique.
Willing partners certainly do help. David Cadden from Quinnipiac University and Dan Papermaster, we thank you so much for being on the program today. We may have you on again when we have an earlier primary.